May 1943. A half-starved Japanese soldier raises his hands in surrender, expecting bullets. Instead, an American Marine hands him something that changes everything, a canteen of clean water. What happened next would shatter 672 captured soldiers' most fundamental beliefs about their enemy. Their commanders had promised them torture. Propaganda had painted Americans as demons. Better to die fighting, they were taught. Better to end it yourself than face the enemy's cruelty. But cruelty never came. Instead, what these soldiers encountered in American camps would fundamentally transform them. They discovered hospitals, hot meals, safety, and something more dangerous to hatred than any weapon, evidence that everything they'd been taught was a lie. This is the story of how the United States won something far deeper than a battlefield victory. This is the story of how kindness disarmed an enemy's hatred from the inside, permanently rewiring the psychology of men who would return home unable to hate anymore. By the time these prisoners returned to Japan in 1946, they were no longer the soldiers who had sailed to the Pacific Islands believing Americans were barbarians. They had become something the Japanese military never anticipated, walking, talking proof that their enemy's humanity matched their own. May 1943, Pacific Theater, the jungle surrenders. A young Japanese soldier, half-starved and feverish from malaria, raises empty hands to American Marines. His name is Sergeant Kaito Yamamoto, though we know him only through fragmentary records, a file number, a medical chart, a single photograph taken years after the war. He is 23 years old. He expects a bullet. He has been taught this his entire military life. In training compounds under officers who screamed until their voices cracked, Japanese soldiers learned a single inviolable truth. Capture by the Americans means dishonor worse than death. The enemy are barbarians. They torture prisoners. They use bodies for medical experiments. They mock the families of the fallen. Better to ignite a hand grenade and take the cowardly Americans with you than face their cruelty. Kaito has rehearsed this death 1,000 times in his mind. He knows the angle. He knows the moment. He knows that when it comes, and surely it will come, he will think of his mother in Kyoto, and that thought will carry him across the threshold. Instead, an American corporal hands him a canteen. Water. Clean water. The first kindness begins here, in this moment of confusion, when everything Kaito believes starts to crack like a temple bell struck too hard. His hands shake as he drinks. The corporal's face is not demonic. It is simply tired. American faces, Kaito will later write in letters preserved in archives, looked like the faces of farmers he had known, creased with sun, lined with exhaustion, but not cruel. Not the faces of men who enjoyed inflicting pain. This scene, unremarkable in isolation, repeats itself hundreds of times across the Pacific in 1943 and 1944. Each surrender, each moment a young man expected execution and received survival instead, carries within it the seed of a massive psychological transformation that will, over the course of 3 years, systematically dismantle the hatred that Japanese military propaganda had spent decades constructing. By the war's end, thousands of Japanese soldiers will carry this same experience home with them. They will carry it like a secret wound, not an injury that causes pain, but a transformation that causes shame in the eyes of their own countrymen. They will have learned something that no amount of propaganda can unlearn. The enemy is human. The enemy is kind. The enemy is in many ways superior in their restraint and their honor. This knowledge will cost many of them dearly. To understand the magnitude of the transformation that awaited captured Japanese soldiers, one must first understand the system that shaped them. The Japanese military propaganda apparatus was a masterpiece of psychological engineering, designed not merely to make soldiers willing to fight, but to make them willing to die rather than surrender. It was a complete reimagining of traditional concepts of honor and shame, weaponized through education, religion, and the absolute authority of military command. The foundation of this system rested on a distortion of Bushido, the historical code of the samurai. What began as an honor code focused on loyalty and duty had been transformed by the 1930s and 1940s into something far more sinister, a doctrine of absolute obedience to the military state and the emperor, where individual survival was not merely secondary, but actively shameful. In 1941, the Japanese military distributed the Shinjin-kun, the instructions for the battlefield. This document was not a suggestion. It was the law of existence for every Japanese soldier. The Shinjin-kun explicitly forbade surrender. It did not mildly discourage it. It forbade it in terms that brook no interpretation. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. These words were not academic. They were spiritual law. They meant that a soldier who allowed himself to be captured had already failed in the most fundamental way. His very existence as a prisoner was a stain that could only be removed by death, either in battle or through his own hand. Combined with this spiritual messaging was a practical curriculum of terror. Officers told soldiers that Americans were savages. Detailed stories circulated through military ranks describing American torture methods. Soldiers were shown propaganda cartoons depicting Americans as demon-faced barbarians with blood-stained hands and monstrous appetites. Some depictions were explicitly racist, designed to reinforce both military propaganda and the existing Japanese cultural prejudices against Westerners. The psychological architecture was ingenious in its completeness. Every message reinforced the same truth. Surrender equals shame. Americans are monsters. Death in battle is the only honorable path. Lieutenant Ren Sato, captured in the same campaign as Sergeant Kato, wrote years later that this propaganda was not background noise. It was the water he swam in. Every superior officer reinforced it. Every training exercise was premised on it. When he raised his hands in surrender, he was not merely admitting military defeat. He was admitting to a fundamental personal failure, a failure so profound that many soldiers expected immediate execution as mercy. The military doctors who had examined new soldiers during induction sometimes warned them, "If you are captured, Americans will use you for medical experiments. They will inject diseases into your body. You will be a test subject until you die slowly, screaming." This fear was not incidental. It was part of the fabric of military psychological preparation. When soldiers imagined surrender, they imagined not merely capture, but torture, systematic, methodical, prolonged torture designed to break the human spirit before breaking the body. It was into this psychological landscape that 672 Japanese soldiers were loaded onto the USNS Vanguard after the fall of Fortuna Atoll in early 1943, bound for an unknown destination, the United States. The hold of the USNS Vanguard was not a luxury cruise ship. It was crowded, poorly ventilated, and equipped with the minimal necessities demanded by military regulations. Yet for soldiers accustomed to the starvation rations and brutal discipline of Japanese military camps, the experience was surreal, almost incomprehensibly surreal. The first shock came with food. American soldiers served the prisoners steaming trays of rice, meat, coffee, and bread. Not minimal rations designed to keep men barely alive, but actual meals. The men, cramped in the hold, regarded the food with deep suspicion. Kaito later recounted that he assumed it was poisoned. Why else would the enemy provide abundance? The first man to eat without dying became, in a real sense, a religious figure. His courage, or recklessness, transformed the hunger-crazed prisoner's understanding of reality. If the food was poisoned, this man would die. If he survived, then perhaps. Perhaps the Americans were not planning to torture them to death during the voyage. By the third day, word had spread through the hold. The food was real. The abundance was real. The American guards who served it and who responded without violence to requests for more water were treating them as if they were not enemies, but simply people. The voyage across the Pacific took weeks. During that time, something began to happen that the Japanese military's psychological engineers had not anticipated. Cognitive dissonance was being systematically dismantled. Every interaction contradicted the propaganda. When men became sick, American medical personnel responded with medical care, the same medical care provided to American troops. When prisoners asked questions, they were answered, not beaten. When the guards changed shifts, new guards treated the prisoners with the same matter-of-fact decency as the previous ones. By the time the USNS Vanguard pulled into Port Emerald on the American mainland, the seeds of transformation were already sprouting. What the prisoners saw when they disembarked, however, shocked them in ways the shipboard experience had not prepared them for. The American landscape itself was propaganda, not intentionally, but far more effectively. An endless city of electric lights stretched beyond the horizon. Automobiles moved without horses. Steel buildings rose into the sky. The prosperity was not merely visible, it was overwhelming. It was incomprehensible. Kaido, in letters written decades later, described standing on the dock and realizing with a sudden terrible clarity, Japan cannot win this war. A nation that possessed this level of industrial capacity, this density of infrastructure, this abundance of resources, such a nation could not be defeated by willpower alone. And if Japan could not win, then everything the officers had promised, everything the propaganda had assured, had been false from the beginning. This realization came to the prisoners not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a falling feeling, as if the earth beneath their feet had disappeared. Camp Whispering Pines, Camp Sunstone Mesa, and Camp Rio Blanco. The American prisoner of war camps established for Japanese soldiers operated under a specific mandate. They must comply with the Geneva Convention. This compliance was not universal. Racial prejudice affected the treatment of Japanese POWs compared to German POWs, but it was real and it was systematic in a way that made it impossible to ignore. Sergeant Kato and Lieutenant Ren Sato were assigned to different camps, as were most of the 672 men from the Vanguard. This separation itself was significant. In Japanese military compounds, such transfers would have been marked by brutality. Men would have been beaten during processing. Authority would have been asserted through pain. The American processing was methodical and, shockingly, impersonal in a way that seemed almost kind. At Camp Whispering Pines in New Mexico, Kaido was assigned to a barracks with 30 other men. The barracks was simple, wooden frames, basic insulation, military-issue blankets, but it was, paradoxically, comfortable beyond the standard experience of Japanese military life. More crucially, it was not designed as a place of punishment. It was designed as a place where prisoners would live. The routine was rigid. Wake at 6 in the morning, breakfast at 6:30, work detail by 7:30, lunch at noon, afternoon labor until 4, dinner at 5:30, lights out at 9. It was a schedule of military precision. What was revolutionary, however, was that the schedule never deviated into cruelty. The meals never varied into starvation. The labor was steady but not designed to destroy the body. For men accustomed to the casual brutality of the Imperial Japanese Army, where officers beat soldiers for minor infractions and starvation was a standard consequence of military life, this represented a kind of paradise so different from their training that it initially seemed incomprehensible. On his first night, Ren Sato lay awake in the darkness, listening for the sounds of torture that must surely follow. The American guards had locked the barracks doors, not to trap them, he understood, but to prevent escape. But where was the cruelty? Where was the beating that would establish dominance? Where was the interrogation? What he heard instead was the faint, smooth lilt of a woman's voice, singing a love song drifting from the guard station radio. The enemy, he thought, with an almost religious shock, was lulling him to sleep. The daily routine at Camp Whispering Pines was labor, clearing brush, tending gardens, maintaining the camp infrastructure. The work was steady and exhausting, but it was also comprehensible. It was labor with purpose, not punishment. The men were given appropriate tools. When tools broke, they were replaced. When men were injured, medical care was provided. The food remained abundant. A major turning point came when the camp commandant, a Major William H. Foster, a career Army officer from Colorado, instituted a policy that seemed almost incomprehensible to the prisoners. Religious services would be available in nearby towns. Japanese prisoners who requested permission could attend Buddhist services led by monks traveling through the region. This was not standard military practice. This was active accommodation of the prisoners' spiritual needs. When Kaido first asked permission to attend a Buddhist service in a town 30 miles from the camp, he expected denial. Instead, the request was approved. He was loaded onto a truck with a dozen other men. They were not shackled. They were not accompanied by armed guards. There were simply 3 American soldiers riding in the truck, armed not with malice, but with routine military duty. In the Buddhist temple, itself a revelation that such a place existed for Japanese prisoners in America, Kaido experienced something that military training had never prepared him for: the possibility that his captors might respect his spiritual traditions, respect his identity, see him not as an enemy to be broken, but as a man whose soul deserved the same care as their own. He would later describe this moment as the end of his hatred. As the war progressed and American manpower became increasingly strained by military demands, Japanese prisoners were assigned to work details outside the camps. This was technically a violation of the Geneva Convention for POWs captured from industrial nations, but the American military, facing massive labor shortages in agriculture and public works, implemented it anyway, though with specific protections. Prisoners would be paid nominal wages, would be treated as contracted laborers, and would be supervised to prevent escape. It was in these work details that the mythology of American barbarism was finally and completely dismantled. In late 1943, Ren Sato was assigned to a detail clearing agricultural land near Camp Sunstone Mesa. The work was hard, moving rocks, clearing stumps, building fences. But for the first time since his capture, Sato worked alongside American civilians, farmers from the surrounding region who had contracts with the military to employ prisoner labor. These were not military officers. They were ordinary men and women trying to manage agricultural operations while their sons and brothers were fighting overseas. What shocked Sato and the other prisoners working alongside him was that they were not cruel. They were not interested in inflicting suffering. They simply wanted their work done. One farmer, a man named John Ellison, had worked alongside Japanese prisoners for 6 months. In his testimony preserved in Army archives, Ellison described his initial prejudice. "I expected them to be dangerous, to be constantly trying to escape, to be fundamentally different from our men. What I found was that they worked hard when given fair wages, that they were homesick just like our boys were homesick, and that they were, in fact, pretty good people." The revelation was not intellectual, but practical. The Japanese prisoners began, slowly and with deep internal resistance, to revise their understanding of who Americans were. Americans were not uniformly vicious. They were not all militaristic or violent. They were farmers and engineers and doctors and ordinary people trying to live ordinary lives while their nation was at war. A more profound moment came during the summer of 1944 when Sato was assigned to work on the farm of the Kellerman family near Rio Blanco, Colorado. The Kellermans had 2 children, a son serving in the Pacific, though the prisoners did not know this, and a daughter, 17-year-old Margaret, who helped manage the farm while their son was away. On a July afternoon, working in the fields under a fierce Colorado sun, Sato and the other prisoners had been given minimal water by the civilian supervisor. The sun was intense. Men were becoming dizzy. Their performance was declining. Margaret Kellerman, observing from the farmhouse, understood what was happening. She brought out a large jug of cold water and, walking directly into the field where prisoners were working, began offering cups of water to each man. When she reached Sato, she smiled, a simple, uncomplicated smile of human kindness, and held out a cup. In that moment, something fundamental broke in him. He was the enemy. He had been trained to believe that everything about American culture was corrupt and barbaric. Yet here was a 17-year-old girl in the middle of a war where her own brother might be captured by men like him, offering him water with a smile, not from fear, not from military order, from simple, human compassion. Sato accepted the water. His hands shook as he drank. The girl had already moved on to the next prisoner. Decades later, in the 1970s, Sato would write a letter to Margaret Kellerman, now Margaret Hutchins, living in a small town in Colorado. "You were the moment I began to die as a soldier and to live as a human," he wrote. "I did not know how to accept kindness. I had never been taught. but you taught me that day, and I have never forgotten." Margaret Hutchins would eventually respond to Sato's letter, and they would become lifelong friends, a friendship that began in a field during wartime and lasted through decades of peace, a friendship that was, in its own way, the most profound victory of the American military in the war with Japan. Not the defeat of an enemy, but the transformation of an enemy into a friend. By 1944, the American military understood something crucial. The transformation occurring among Japanese prisoners was not accidental. It was the direct result of American treatment policies, and it was extraordinarily valuable. Prisoners who had been transformed through kindness were more cooperative, more reliable, and more importantly, they could become assets in the larger propaganda war against Japan. The Army established educational programs within the camp specifically designed to expose prisoners to American democratic values, industrial capacity, and the freedom available to ordinary American citizens. These programs were not indoctrination in a crude sense. They were rather a systematic demonstration of reality that contradicted Japanese military propaganda. Prisoners attended films, Hollywood movies, and newsreels showing American life. They saw comedies and westerns, images of Americans laughing and living ordinary lives, soldiers joking with each other, families eating together, young people dancing. The films were not explicitly propaganda. They were simply American life presented without editing. And for men who had been taught that Americans were spiritually and morally bankrupt, these images of ordinary human happiness were more corrosive to propaganda than any intentional countermessage could have been. In the camp's libraries, Japanese prisoners were allowed access to American newspapers, magazines, and books. They read about American industry, American sports, American politics. They saw maps showing the advancing American military positions and the shrinking Japanese-controlled territory. They began to understand with mathematical clarity the material disparity between the two nations. American factories produced tanks and aircraft at rates that dwarfed Japanese capacity. American ships outnumbered Japanese ships. American resources were abundant where Japanese resources were scarce. What the Japanese military had always forbidden, the recognition that America might be more powerful, more prosperous, and more organized than Japan, became undeniable through simple exposure to facts. By 1944, Kaito and Sato and hundreds of other prisoners had undergone a complete cognitive reorganization. They no longer hated their captors. Many had come to genuinely like individual Americans they had worked with or studied under. They had absorbed enough of American culture to begin, in small ways, to think like Americans, to understand American humor, to appreciate American values of individual liberty and democratic participation. More importantly, they had seen something that their military training had made forbidden: the possibility that America might actually be, in many ways, a superior civilization. Not in a military sense, the war was still undecided in 1944, but in terms of material well-being, individual freedom, and the ordinary happiness of ordinary people. This realization was dangerous. If one's entire military identity was built on the premise that the enemy was morally and culturally inferior, then the recognition that the enemy might actually be superior in crucial ways was not merely disorienting, it was spiritually catastrophic. Yet for these prisoners, catastrophe became liberation. Many began to experience something that the Japanese military had never prepared them for: hope. Hope that if Japan could be transformed the way they had been transformed, their nation might actually become a better place. This hope was fragile and constantly attacked by the propaganda messages still arriving through Japanese radio broadcasts and in letters from home. But it persisted. In this hope lay the seeds of something far larger than individual transformation, the seeds of a potential reconstruction of Japan based not on militarism and imperial conquest, but on the democratic values they had glimpsed in America. The war ended on August 15, 1945, with Emperor Hirohito's radio announcement of surrender. Japanese soldiers across the Pacific heard the words, "The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage," and knew that the mythology had collapsed. Everything the military had promised had proved false. For prisoners like Kaito and Sato, the announcement came as a relief coupled with unexpected grief. Relief that the war had ended. Grief at what the end meant, that they would have to return to a Japan they barely remembered, a nation that had been systematically destroyed by American bombing, a homeland that no longer resembled the place they had left. More immediately, they faced a complex set of emotions regarding their imminent repatriation. In late 1945, the American military began organizing the return of Japanese prisoners to Japan. Ships like the USNS Vanguard, the same vessel that had brought them to America, were now converted to transport them home. But before they left American soil, many prisoners spent their final days in a state of profound ambivalence. They were going home, but they were leaving behind the only place that had treated them with dignity and kindness. They were returning to a devastated nation that had lied to them systematically about their enemy. Many had formed genuine friendships with Americans, prisoners who had worked alongside them, guards who had shown kindness, officers who had respected their humanity. Kaito and Sato in separate camps made the same request, to write letters to the Americans they had known. The military, understanding the value of these communications, allowed it. The letters, now preserved in various archives, reveal the depth of the transformation. "Dear Major Foster," Kaito wrote, "I am returning to Japan with many memories. I came to your country as a soldier, taught that all Americans were my enemies, that capture meant certain torture and death. Instead, I learned that you are a good people, that your nation is powerful and free, that ordinary Americans are kind and fair. I will carry this knowledge all my life. In my heart, America will always be the place where I learned to be human instead of being a soldier. Thank you." Sato's letter to Margaret Hutchins was even more poignant. "Dear Miss Kellerman, I will not forget the day you gave me water. In my country, we do not speak much about love to people we barely know. But I will say that I love America because America has people like you. When I return to Japan, I will tell my family that the enemy is not enemy, but friend. I hope you will remember that a Japanese soldier once learned to smile because of you." These letters were not unique. Hundreds of similar letters were written. The American military understood their propaganda value and encouraged the practice. But the value was real because the sentiments were authentic. These men truly had been transformed. The ships carrying Japanese prisoners arrived at Yokohama Harbor in January 1946, 7 months after the war had ended. The prisoners had spent months in American camps after the war's conclusion, waiting for transportation and processing. They had continued to receive American meals, continued to experience American hospitality, even in defeat. When they stepped off the ships onto Japanese soil, the contrast was incomprehensible. Japan had been transformed into a wasteland. American bombing had systematically destroyed Japanese cities. Tokyo was ash. Yokohama was rubble. Osaka, Nagoya, Hiroshima, all had been incinerated. The population was starving. The infrastructure had collapsed. American occupation forces controlled everything. The returning prisoners, healthy and well-fed from American camps, stood out starkly against the skeletal survivors of the Japanese homeland. They were not welcomed as heroes. They were treated with suspicion and, in many cases, with contempt. Military authorities, even in defeat, often treated returned prisoners as contaminations. Several prisoners reported being told by former officers that they should commit suicide to cleanse their dishonor at having been captured. The shame of captivity, the military culture insisted, could only be erased through death. But something had changed in these men. They had learned through daily experience that life was worth living. They had learned that shame was a cultural construct, not an absolute truth. They had learned to think for themselves, to question propaganda, to evaluate reality through their own observations rather than through the ideology they had been fed. Many refused to commit suicide. They refused to accept the shame. They insisted on living. This defiance was, in its own way, revolutionary. The American occupation of Japan, which lasted from 1945 until 1952, faced an enormous challenge: how to transform a militaristic imperial nation into a democratic society without imposing change in a way that would create resentment and resistance. Recognizing the value of Japanese prisoners who had experienced American culture firsthand, American occupation authorities began employing them as interpreters, advisors, and cultural liaisons. Their English language skills made them immediately useful. More valuable, however, was their psychological state. They had no militant hostility toward America. They were not ideologically opposed to democratic values. They had experienced American freedom and prosperity firsthand. Kaido was hired as an interpreter and administrative assistant at the occupation headquarters in Tokyo. Sato was assigned to work with the education reforms being implemented across Japan, helping to design new curricula that emphasized democratic values and individual rights rather than imperial obedience and military glory. These men became, in a sense, unexpected agents of Japanese transformation. Their authenticity, they were not foreign impositions, but Japanese who had genuinely come to value American democratic principles, made them credible messengers in a way that foreign occupation officials could never be. When Japanese civilians asked these returned prisoners about America, they received answers from someone who spoke Japanese, who understood Japanese culture, who had actually lived in America rather than studied it from a distance. Is it true that in America, ordinary people can speak against the government without being arrested? A young man asked Kaido in 1946. Yes, Kaido replied. I have seen it myself. I have read newspapers that criticize the government. The government did not arrest the newspaper. The government did not arrest the journalist. This is freedom. These conversations, repeated thousands of times across Japan in 1946 and 1947, were deeply subversive to the old order. They were subversive because they were true. They were subversive because they came from credible sources, Japanese who had been taught to hate America and who had instead learned to respect and appreciate American values. The occupation authorities recognized this dynamic and, in some cases, explicitly supported it. Educational materials distributed in Japanese schools in 1946 and 1947 included testimonies from returned prisoners describing American democratic institutions. Former soldiers described American schools where students debated teachers, American factories where workers had unions and negotiated collectively, American society where a person's value was not determined by their family's social class or their military rank, but by their own abilities and accomplishments. This was not, strictly speaking, propaganda. It was the truth as experienced by credible witnesses, and truth delivered by credible sources was far more persuasive than any propagandistic message could have been. The transformation that occurred in Japanese prisoners was not a simple matter of propaganda replaced by counter-propaganda. It was a complete reorganization of how these men understood reality itself. Before capture, Japanese soldiers had been embedded in a system where all information came through official military channels. All books they read, all speeches they heard, all films they watched, all lessons they received had been filtered through military ideology. The system was not simply authoritarian, it was totalitarian in the modern sense. It sought to control not merely behavior, but thought itself. When Japanese soldiers were captured and placed in American camps, they were suddenly exposed to an entirely different information ecosystem. American newspapers presented multiple viewpoints. American films showed American society without official censorship. American officers explained American military strategy and American political values. American civilians with whom prisoners worked were free to express dissenting views, to question authority, to think and speak independently. For minds that had never experienced this kind of intellectual freedom, the experience was genuinely transformative. Men like Kaido and Sato, for the first time in their adult lives, were able to think for themselves. They were able to evaluate evidence, form their own conclusions, and develop genuine personal opinions about their captors and their war. The conclusion they reached, based on direct observation, was revolutionary. America was more advanced, more prosperous, more humane, and ultimately more powerful than Japan. Japan could not win this war. The propaganda had been a lie. And if the propaganda had been a lie about the military prospects, perhaps it had been a lie about other things as well, about the nature of honor, about the value of individual life, about what constitutes a good society. This realization was dangerous to the military because it threatened to undermine the ideological foundation of the entire system. But it was liberating to the individuals who experienced it because it freed them from a closed system of thought and opened the possibility of genuine choice. By the time these men returned to Japan, they had been transformed in ways that no re-education program could have accomplished from the outside. They had not been convinced by American arguments. They had been convinced by American reality, observed directly and evaluated through their own judgment. In various American and Japanese archives, the letters written by returned prisoners provide the most direct evidence of this transformation. These are not official documents or propaganda materials. They are personal communications, often written at great personal cost. Japanese society in 1946 was deeply suspicious of anyone who seemed too sympathetic to America, and expressing gratitude to American captors could invite accusation of being insufficiently loyal to Japan. Yet these letters were written. Men risked social ostracism to maintain contact with Americans who had shown them kindness. A letter dated March 1947 from a former prisoner named Yoshiko Nakamura to his former camp commandant, Major William H. Foster, states, "I am writing to you from a devastated country trying to rebuild itself. Each day I see people suffering from hunger and cold. I think of the abundance we had in the camp. I used to resent your authority as a prisoner. Now I understand that your kindness was a form of strength, not weakness. I tell my friends and family that this is what Japan must become. A nation where people are treated with dignity and where strength comes from justice rather than from cruelty." Another letter from Ren Sato to Margaret Hutchins in 1948 reveals the specific mechanisms of transformation. "I am teaching in a school now, helping to rebuild Japanese education. I tell my students that in America, education is meant to make you think for yourself, not to make you believe what you are told. I tell them that this is the greatest gift America gave me, not the food or the safety, but the freedom to think. I try to give my students this same freedom." These letters, accumulated across the post-war years, reveal a pattern. Men who had been taught to hate their enemy had come to respect their enemy. Men who had been taught that their nation was superior had learned to recognize American superiority. Men who had been taught that surrender was shame had learned that survival and growth required accepting change. The legacy of these transformations extended far beyond the individual. Many of these returned prisoners became leaders in post-war Japan. They became teachers, administrators, government officials, and intellectuals. They became agents of the very democratization and modernization that American occupation authorities hoped to accomplish. In a very real sense, the American policy of humane treatment of Japanese prisoners contributed directly to the success of the occupation and to Japan's transformation from a militaristic imperial state into a democratic, peaceful, and prosperous nation. The transformation of Japanese prisoners represents something that military strategists rarely speak about directly: the possibility that the deepest victory in war is not the defeat of the enemy's military forces, but the conversion of the enemy into an ally, through demonstrating superior values. By treating Japanese prisoners with humanity, by providing them with food and safety and dignity, by showing them through example that democratic society could function without cruelty, and that individual freedom was compatible with social order, the American military did something far more profound than secure military advantage. They changed how an entire generation of Japanese men thought about themselves and their future. These men returned to Japan unable to advocate for renewed military conflict, unable to believe in imperial expansion, unable to support the values that had led to the war. They were, in effect, an internal force for peace and democratization, far more effective because they were Japanese, and because their transformation had been based on direct experience rather than external imposition. This was a victory so complete that it was, in some sense, invisible. There were no parades celebrating it. There were no monuments erected to commemorate it. But it was visible in the transformation of Japan from a military dictatorship to a constitutional democracy in the space of a few years after the war's end. It was visible in the fact that Japan, after losing a total war and being occupied by a foreign power, did not resist occupation with insurgent violence, but instead cooperated in its own transformation. It was visible in the fact that Japanese society, which had been built on militarism and imperial mythology, accepted democratization and constitutional government without widespread violence or social breakdown. Much of this peaceful transition was the result of careful occupation policies and the wisdom of both American occupation authorities and Japanese leaders willing to accept change. But underlying all of these factors was the simple fact that thousands of Japanese soldiers had experienced American kindness and American values directly. They had been converted not through propaganda or coercion, but through lived experience. They had become walking, breathing evidence that peace and prosperity were possible, that democracy could work, that Americans were not enemies but potential friends and teachers. Despite the profound historical significance of this transformation, the story of Japanese prisoners' conversion in American camps remains largely unknown in both America and Japan. In America, the narrative of the Pacific War has been dominated by images of combat, the island-hopping campaign, the battles, the ultimate victory. The story of prisoners has been overshadowed by the story of soldiers. The humanization of the enemy is not a comfortable narrative for military history. In Japan, the story has been even more suppressed. Japanese society in the immediate post-war years was processing profound trauma, the loss of the war, the devastation of the nation, the occupation by a foreign power, the story of prisoners who had been treated well by their captors and who had come to appreciate American values was seen by many Japanese as a story of collaboration with the enemy. It was a story that complicated Japan's sense of itself and its victimhood. Yet the evidence remains, preserved in archives, letters, military records, testimonies, memoirs written decades after the war by men like Kaito and Sato, reflecting on what their captivity had meant. What these documents reveal is a historical truth that contemporary observers often missed, that the ultimate victory in war is not the destruction of the enemy, but the transformation of the enemy into something other than an enemy. That kindness in war is not weakness, but a form of strength so profound that it can permanently change the trajectory of history. Sergeant Kaito Yamamoto lived until 1988, dying at age 68. He spent his post-war years working in Japanese education, helping to develop curricula that emphasized peace and democratic values. In interviews conducted in the 1980s, shortly before his death, he reflected on his time in American camps. It was there that I learned what it means to be human. I had been taught that the greatest honor was to die for the emperor. It was in America that I learned that the greatest honor is to live for peace and for the people you love. Lieutenant Ren Sato also lived a long life until 1991, dying at age 71. He became a teacher and later a professor of English language and American studies at Tokyo University. He maintained correspondence with Margaret Hutchins throughout his life. When she died in 1989, he wrote in his memorial notice, "She taught me that kindness has no nationality. In a moment of war, a young American girl showed me the future of peace. I have tried to spend my life honoring that gift." The most remarkable of the returned prisoners, perhaps, was a man named Miyoshi Ichiro, who had been held at Camp Livingstone in Louisiana. After the war, he became a journalist and wrote extensively about his experience. His memoir, published in Japan in 1956, became influential in shaping Japanese understanding of American culture. In it, he describes the moment he realized that his hatred had permanently transformed. "I sat in the American camp library reading American newspapers. I read about American soldiers who disagreed with their officers. I read about American civilians who criticized the war. I understood that disagreement and criticism were not dangerous. They were normal. In that moment, I realized that the American system was stronger than the Japanese system, not because Americans were inherently more powerful, but because Americans had learned how to disagree without destroying each other. This was the secret America possessed, and it was the secret Japan needed to learn."